In this video, we're going to get our deploy launcher and our deploy client working. So our deploy launcher and deploy client, we zip them up and we upload them. That's pretty much all we do. But there's actually an additional step we have to keep in mind, and that is establishing our build number. Now, if you recall, our build number is this little class right here that specifies a version and a timestamp. But I want this build number to not only be sent to our API, but I want it to actually be encoded into the project itself. So I want this build number to be placed inside the binaries that are going to result from building either the client or the launcher. So to do that, I'm going to need to be able to write a file into these projects before they're built in order to get the timestamp kind of established. So we're going to need to create another task, or rather, before we build the solution, we're going to need to execute some code that'll build that file for us. But before we build that file, we need to establish the timestamp, and to get the timestamp, we need to create another task that allows us to acquire the Unix timestamp, which is the amount of milliseconds that have expired since January 1st, 1970. Okay, so to do this, we need actual C# code inside of our MS build file. The best way to perform this is actually to create an additional C# class library that has classes in it that extend from a particular base type, and then add those classes into our build. So what I mean by that, I mean being able to execute those classes from within a task or a target inside of our build. So to do that, we need to first create the actual C# project. So I'm going to come up here to build, I'm going to right click build, I'm going to say add new project, and I'm going to go up here to Visual C#, Windows, I'm going to select class library, and I'm going to call this buzzmmo.build.tasks. And I'm going to hit OK. So buzzmmo.build.tasks is going to be responsible for creating the C# code that we're going to need in order to finish our build pipeline. So first of all, we need two tasks. We need one task that's going to establish a timestamp by acquiring the Unix timestamp of the current time, and then set it to a variable inside of our build pipeline. And then we need another task that actually updates a file inside of our project to indicate what build number, or if it's in debug mode, that was used when we built it. So we're basically going to have another test that actually goes in and changes the file before compilation. So I'm going to go ahead and delete class 1, and we're going to need to add some references. So I'm going to say right-click references, hit add reference, and I'm going to go up here to assemblies, and I don't know if it's going to be under extensions. It looks like some are under extensions, some are under framework. These are all system. Okay, here we go. Under framework assemblies, we're going to need to add a reference to Microsoft.build. We're going to need to add a reference to build.engine, build.framework, build.tasks.v0, and build.utilities.v0. So again, Microsoft.build, Microsoft.build.engine, build.framework, build.tasks version 4.0, and build.utilities version 4.0. So these are the assemblies that we'll need in order to add our new tasks. Then I'm going to hit OK. I'm also going to right-click Build Tasks, go back to Add References, and I'm going to come in here to Solution and add a reference to buzzmmo.base. And then click OK. Now the reason I'm adding a reference to buzzmmo.base is I actually want to add the class that performs the time calculation inside of buzzmmo.base so that it's shared for all of our projects, not just our build tasks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up here and I'm going to add a new class to buzzmmo.base, and I'm going to call it, let's just call it time, and hit OK. This will be a static class. Now currently, let's go ahead and just create two methods. Let's say public static uint get Unix timestamp. Get Unix timestamp will simply return get Unix timestamp passing in date time dot utc now. And of course, date time will bring in using system. Then we're going to create another overload of this method called public uint get Unix timestamp with a date time time. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say var timestamp equals in parentheses time dot to universal time, which will have no effect because old Unix timestamps are in universal time, but this will have no effect when we pass in a UTC now. So don't worry about when we pass into UTC now it getting converted twice. To universal time will not do anything if the time was originally in UTC. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say minus new date time 1970, and then we're going to pass in January 1st at 000. Then I'm going to say return cast to uint timestamp dot total seconds. So again, the Unix timestamp is the amount of seconds that have elapsed since 1970 January 1st. And we're casting it to a uint so that it's slightly bigger because we don't want to worry about dates before this time. And by not worrying about dates before this time, we get a lot more time to add additional time, if that makes sense. We have more bits to allocate to the actual amount of seconds. Okay, so now that we've created our time class, let's go ahead and write a task that I'm going to invoke inside of our MS build project that's going to be responsible for getting the Unix timestamp and setting it inside of a variable. So I'm going to come up here to BuzzMMO build tasks. I'm going to create a new class, and I'm going to call it get Unix timestamp. Get Unix timestamp will inherit from task. Task we're going to want to get from our Microsoft build.utilities namespace, not our system threading. So make sure that you're getting a task from Microsoft build.utilities. You'll notice that this task class is abstract and will require us to create an override for execute. But in addition to that, we also need to specify an output parameter. What do I mean by that? Well, because we're going to be getting a Unix timestamp and we're going to be placing it inside of a variable for MS Build, we need to specify a property of this class that is marked as an output to our build script. So I'm going to say output, which is going to require me to import Microsoft Build Framework, which you see up there at the top. Then I'm going to say public string timestamp get set. So this property is going, when I reference it inside of my MS Build file, it's going to allow me to set data into it and pass data back into my MS Build file. Okay, so my public override bool execute method is simply going to say timestamp equals time dot get Unix timestamp, and that's why we had to add that reference to buzzmmo.base. And of course, we have to add in a using buzzmmo.base at the top. Then we need to convert it into a string, so we do .toString. And then instead of returning false, we return true. Returning false will indicate that this build step failed. Returning true will indicate that this build step succeeded. Okay, so we've now established that we can get the Unix timestamp. Let's go ahead and see this in action, and then we'll write our code for actually modifying that file pre-build. So let's jump back into buzzmmo.build.proj and talk about how we're going to actually acquire that timestamp before we perform the build. Well, this presents us an interesting paradox. When we build the solution, it builds our tasks, but we need our tasks in order to build the solution. So on our build solution, I'm actually going to execute an MS build before that. I'm going to say MS build projects equals buzzmmo.build.tasks / buzzmmo.build.tasks.csproj. Then I'm going to say properties equals configuration equals build config. So remember, this MS build is going to execute from within the folder that that our solution is inside of. So in order to go from that folder, which our solution is inside of, which you see right here, we need to go up into BuzzMMO build tasks and get the BuzzMMO build tasks CS proj. Remember, this folder is virtual and doesn't actually exist on the hard drive. When I say this folder, I mean the build folder in our solution. Okay, so we're now building our tasks before we perform this step, but now what we have to do is we have to specify that we're going to be using a particular task inside of our build solution. So in order to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to specify our using tasks up here above or below our property group. Now fortunately, when we're outside of a target, things don't execute sequentially, meaning if I were to use the task that's defined in BuzzMMO build tasks here, it'll pick up on the DLL that was built after that step, as opposed to the DLL as it existed before. So what we need to do is we need to import our task. We need to import this task. So how do we do that? Well, inside of our proj, we say using task. Then we have to give it a task name. The task name is going to be the class. So the class is going to be buzzmmo.build.tasks.get Unix timestamp. But after we specify the task name, we also have to specify the assembly. So the assembly file is going to be buzzmmo.build.tasks/bin/ and then build config as a parameter /buzzmmo.build.tasks.dll. So what does this do? Well, this simply imports a task name, so that's the task name right there, which is our fully qualified name to the class. Then it specifies the assembly file. Now, when we're in production mode, we want to grab the release version, and when we're in debug mode, we want to grab the debug version. So now that we're using this task, let's go ahead and see what we have to do in order to actually find the Unix timestamp when this thing was deployed. So we need to execute this task, but we need to execute it and then stuff it inside of a parameter. The way we do that is I'm going to say get Unix timestamp as an element. And then inside of this element, I'm going to say output, and I'm going to say task parameter equals timestamp, property name equals timestamp. So what does this do? Well, we invoke the get Unix timestamp task, which is imported via this using task right here. And then we specify that its timestamp property needs to be stuffed into a build parameter called timestamp, meaning we can now reference timestamp. So how do we test this? Again, you should always, whenever you do stuff like this, you should test it as early as possible, even if the entire file isn't complete yet. So to test this, I'm simply going to come down here, I'm going to say warning, text equals timestamp as a variable. Okay, coming back into our developer command prompt, I'm going to type in msbuild buzzmmo build proj, which will execute our build solution. Hit enter and see what we get. Look at that. That is a beautiful thing right there. We get a warning with a number that looks surprisingly close, or probably is exactly, our current Unix timestamp. So now we can know when this project was built by referencing the timestamp variable. You'll also notice that this execution does prove that despite the fact we typed in using task up here, it didn't actually try to load this assembly file until we actually used the task, which is really cool because that allows us to build our tasks, execute our tasks, and then build our project. Okay, so we now have our timestamp properly being represented. We now have our timestamp now being set as a build parameter. So now what we need to do with it is we need to stuff it into two files before we build the project. A, we need to stuff it into our client project, and B, we need to stuff it into our launcher project because both our client and our launcher will be versioned. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to go ahead and come up here. Well, no, I'm going to talk about how we're going to do that in the first place. The way we're going to do this is with an assembly attribute. So let's look at what that assembly attribute is going to look like. The assembly attribute is going to be an attribute that we can apply to assembly and then pick it up at runtime so that we know when things are being, or we can extract data from our build. So inside of buzzmmo.base, I'm going to create a new class called build number attribute. And hit enter. Build number attribute is going to inherit from attribute, and it's going to have an attribute usage, so attribute usage of attribute target assembly. Then we need a couple parameters and a constructor. So I'm going to say public build number, well, that's not how you spell number, get private set, and then public bool is debug, get private set. Then I'm going to create a constructor, public build number attribute, that's going to pass in uint, let's say build number, or how about build version, uint timestamp, bool is debug. Number is going to be instantiated to build version, which is actually a short, not an int. We should specify that right there, short. And then timestamp, and then isDebug is going to be set to isDebug. And our timestamps are actually integers here. And I just remembered that when we did our code with the API that we switched that over to integer. Let's go ahead and just do timestamps as integers. That gives us enough time, really, for our purposes. So I'm going to specify int as timestamp. I'm also going to come up here to our time class of buzzmmo.base, and I'm going to change this from uint to int. I'm going to change this from uint to int, and I'm going to change this from uint to int, so that we're returning signed integers as opposed to unsigned integers. Just that we're a little bit consistent. Okay, jumping back into the build number attribute, what this allows us to now do is we can now say assembly build number 1 true, for example. So this is now it doesn't like that. Attribute is not valid on this. It's only valid on assembly. We are an assembly. What are you trying to do to me? And of course, this isn't going to work because our assembly attributes can't be defined after a class. So for example, if I took this up here and I placed it above the namespace, and then I fully qualified it to buzzmmo.base.buildNumber, and you'll see we get code that will compile. So again, I'm not saying to type this out on your screen because we're going to be deleting in a second. I just wanted to show you a usage of applying this assembly attribute to our assembly. So that's the code that we're going to inject into our client and into our launcher. But we're going to have some problems. And well, we're going to have a question that we need to answer, which is how do we extract the build number attribute from the currently running assembly? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write a helper method on our build number attribute. It's going to be a public static build number attribute current build number. And the static method will allow us to, we'll be able to execute the static method in order to, at runtime, acquire the build version from our assembly. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say var attribute equals appdomain dot current domain, or actually I can just, yeah, this is going to be interesting. I'll say current domain get assemblies dot select. Assembly goes into assembly dot get custom attribute, passing in type of build number attribute and false, dot of type build number attribute first or default. Let's go ahead and let's break this up a little bit. There we go. So it's a little bit easier to read. And then, of course, to make this compile, we're going to have to import system.link at the top. And then, whoops. I misspelled stuff, which really isn't surprising. Okay, so I think that all fits on one screen just fine. Okay, so in order to, let's say we have this built into one of our projects, what we want to do is we want to get all the loaded assemblies, and then we want to select out a the result of telling that assembly to get its custom attributes of build number attribute, and then having that turn into a typed IEnumerable of build number attribute, and then saying .first or default, which will return an IEnumerable of build number attribute. Or sorry, we'll return just a build number attribute. This attributes is now a IEnumerable of build number attribute. So what we're going to do is we're going to say return attribute, and then we're going to say first or default, t goes into t does not equal null. So we're basically searching all the loaded assemblies, we're finding which one has a build number attribute associated with it, and we're returning the first one. So current build number will return null if there is no assembly attribute like that. Alrighty, let's go ahead and delete that code. And now we have our build number attribute. So how do we use it? Well, we're going to want to have a class added to our client and to our launcher. And that class, or that file, sorry, not a class, it's just a file, that file will be replaced by a build task. So let's go ahead and do that. On my client, I'm going to come over here and I'm going to create a new class, and I'm going to say build info. And then I'm going to delete everything inside of it. And I'm going to say assembly buzz MMO base build number, and I'm going to pass in 0, 0, false. And that's all that's going to be in this file. And this file will be overridden in our build process. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's go ahead and do the same thing to our launcher. So I'm going to come up here, launcher, build, do new class, build info, delete everything inside of it, and replace it with assembly buzz MMO base build number 0, 0, false. Okay, so now that we have these two things set up, our two files that we're going to be replacing, it's important that they're added to the project so they get built into the assembly. What we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead and jump into our buzzmmo build, or sorry, our buzzmmo.build.project. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to import a task that doesn't exist yet, and then execute that task to show you guys the usage of it, and then I'm going to write the actual task. So let's go ahead and do that. Once we've acquired the Unix timestamp, we need to use another task. So I'm going to come up here underneath this using task. I'm going to say using task, task name equals buzzmmo.build.tasks. Let's go ahead and say something like, I don't know what to call it. Update build info is a good enough name. And then the assembly file is going to be the exact same assembly file that we had before. buzzmmo build tasks bin build config buzzmmo build tasks DLL. Now that we've done that, let's actually execute that task, because that task is going to need to know a couple of things. First of all, it's going to need to know the environment. Second, it's going to need to know the current Unix timestamp. And third, it's going to need to know a currently undefined bit of information, the version number. The version number is going to be passed in one of two ways. Either it's going to default to 0 when we're testing, or that version number is going to be supplied by our continuous integration pipeline, so that our first client will be version 1, our second client will be version 2, our third client will be version 3, and so on and so on. Every time we hit that build button, we'll get a new version number printed out. So let's go ahead and see what that'll look like. What we're going to want to do is we're going to want to say update build info. And then we're going to want to pass in a variety of properties into it. First of all, we're going to want to pass in our timestamp. So I'm going to want to say update build info timestamp equals timestamp. Then we're going to want to pass in our actual version number, our build number. So I'm going to say build number, or how about version number to be more consistent, equals version number. Now this version number has not been supplied yet. We haven't yet created this variable, but we will shortly. Okay, so we need to pass in the timestamp, the version number. We want to pass in the environment by saying env equals env. And then we want to pass in a list of files that we will want to perform this operation on. So we want to pass in a list of build info files. So we have our timestamp, we have our build, we have our environment. Let's pass in our files. So I'm going to say files equals. Actually, I'm going to break this out into multiple lines because this files equals attribute is going to get pretty long. So I'm going to say files equals buzz MMO dot client / build info dot cs, comma buzz MMO dot launcher / build info dot cs. So it's just a comma separated list of files that are relative to our current execution directory that I want to have this transformation be applied to, our update build info. Okay, so before we go ahead and actually implement our update build info task, I want to go ahead and get our version number out of the way. Well, actually, no, well, let's go ahead and just say if our version number isn't defined by the person invoking the script, default the version to 1. So on my top property group, I'm going to say version number, condition equals version number equals blank, 1, specifying a default version number of 1. Okay, so now that we've done all that, we can now implement our update build info method. So let's come back here to BuzzMMO build tasks. Then I'm going to create a new class called update build info. And I added a quote at the end of that for some reason. And it's going to inherit from task, which comes from Microsoft Build Utilities, and it's going to implement the execute method, and we're going to do a couple different things inside of it. First of all, we need to specify our parameters. So I'm going to say public string, and then I'm going to say timestamp, public string. Now these properties that I'm creating directly correspond to these attributes that I'm setting. So I want version number, public string env for environment, and then public string files for our files. So basically, I just want to set all these files to equal a particular string. And what's that string going to be? Well, I'm going to say var is debug equals env equals dev. So the environment equals dev is debuggable to be set to true, otherwise it'll be set to false. However, because we're going to be inserting this directly as a string literal, I'll go ahead and throw in a ternary and say true : false. The reason I'm doing that is the string representation of a Boolean data type is uppercase true and uppercase false, which is different from the code that we're going to want to insert into this file. Then I'm going to want to say for each var file in files.split on comma. Well, before I do that, I want to say var file contents. What's the file contents? It's going to be string.format assembly : buzzmmo.base.build number, and then end that bracket there. Now build number, I'm going to want to pass in a placeholder for our version, a placeholder for our timestamp, and a placeholder for our isDebug. And then I'm going to pass in those placeholders. I'm going to pass in, well, actually, let's go ahead and make sure that I got these right. Build version, timestamp, and isDebug. So let's pass in version number, timestamp is debug. Okay, so we now have our file contents set to the string. We can now loop through all of our files and simply say file, uppercase file, which will import system IO at the top, dot write all text, passing in the path of file and the content of file contents. Once we've done that, we simply return true. Okay, in theory, everything should work. So let's go ahead and see what happens. I'm going to come back here, and I'm going to say msbuild buzzmmo build.proj, and I'm going to hit enter. Now we don't get any errors, that's good. But now what I want to do is I want to open up these files in IL Explorer to ensure that the assembly attribute did get applied. So let's go ahead and I'm going to go into, I'm going to launch IL Spy, sorry. I'm going to remove everything out of there. So now we have IL Spy open. Then I'm going to navigate to the folder where our build artifacts will be, which is going to be buzzmmo.client bin. And since we didn't specify an environment of production, it's going to be in debug. As you see, the time 8:11. Okay, so or 8:12. So that's good. Let's go ahead and click and drag base.dll into ILSpy, open it up, and see if we can track down that let me see if we can track down that is it not going to, oh, here we go. We just click on the assembly, and what do we get? We have assembly version debuggable. I'm not seeing any of that. Oh, derp, I dragged in the wrong DLL. We want to drag in buzzmmo.client. I was looking at that assembly and I was like, what? There's a whole lot of stuff that shouldn't be there. Okay, so we click on buzzmmo.client and we should see that we have a build number. Here we go. Build number, version number of 1, proper Unix timestamp, and true set. So true is debug. Let's go ahead and check our launcher. So I'm going to come up here to buzzmmo launcher, bin, debug, drag launcher.exe in, and we get build number 1, proper timestamp, and everything is good. Okay, so we were able to actually go and change some of the code during our build process to update a new version number and then have the assembly build out that version number. Furthermore, we are also able to acquire that version number at runtime. Why is this important? Well, it's important because we might want to say that a server can only support clients that are built for a particular version, and we can reject connections that aren't of that version by specifying the current build number. In addition, we also have this handy isDebug tool that we can use during our code to conditionally allow or deny some bit of logic. Okay, now that we've done all of that, we now can work on our zipping our launcher and uploading our launcher, and then our building standalone Unity build, zipping our Unity build, and uploading our zip. Let's start with our zipping our launcher and uploading our launcher. To do this, we need some sort of zipping utility. However, well, alternatively, we could do that in our own build task, but I want to show you guys how we can import a bunch of very useful build tasks from the MSBuild community package. The MSBuild community package will bring in a bunch of additional cool stuff that will allow us to, well, it'll allow us to do things like zip up folders and all of that great stuff. So let's go ahead and do that. What we need to do is we need, let's see here. We need to pull in our MSBuild community. which requires us to download an additional package. So let's go ahead and download that. All right, and then to do that, let's go ahead and jump over to GitHub. The thing that we want is MS Build Tasks under Loresoft, which is the MS Build Community Tasks package. And it contains, like you can see, a bunch of really cool tasks. So everything from FTP to beeping, I guess, to Git, to IIS, to IL merge, to JavaScript, to math. It just creates a bunch of these tasks that we could import into our project and use them for great good. So let's jump into this on GitHub, which is the URL is up there, loresoft/msbuildtasks. Then we're not going to install it as a NuGet package. I'm just going to pull it down directly and dump it into our project, which will simply require that we click here, and then I'm going to download the zip. I'm not going to download the MSI. And then I'm going to open up the zip. And when you open up the zip, you'll see a DLL, a PDB, a targets, an XML, and an XSD. Really the only files that we care about are the .targets and the DLL. The .targets will contain all of the additional stuff in MS Build that needs to be configured in order to use this package. And the DLL will contain all of the stuff that is the actual code, the actual logic for all these tasks. So I'm going to bring this over here to the side, and I'm going to bring this over here, and I'm going to go open up .src for our Buzz MMO. Then I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to say I don't know what just happened. I don't know why. What is going on? Why is it? Huh. Do I have like caps lock on or something? Because every time I hit dot, whoa, make it stop. Okay, Windows is freaking out and I can't, there we go. Okay, let's try dot one more time. Nope, it does that weird thing. I can't type in dot. I just, okay, let's type dots. I can't type dot there either. Let's type dot into Visual, I know I can type dot into Visual Studio. Whoa. Okay, guys, I'm going to pause the video for...
Right.
Yeah, sorry about that, guys. Looks like I got into some, like, weird command mode with shortcuts, and when I was hitting dot, it was, like, zooming my window out so I can move it around to another desktop or something weird like that. Must be some Windows 8.1 special shortcut thing. I don't know how I activated it, but I did, and now it's fixed. Okay, let's go ahead and bring this back over here and bring this back over here. And the new folder we're going to be creating is going to be dot, see I can actually hit dot now, dot build. Oh, come on. Let's just call it build. No, that would be ambiguous. Let's call it tasks. There we go. I'm not going to play the dot game with Explorer today. So we're going to call this folder tasks, and I'm going to open it up. And then I'm going to dump in MS Build Community Tasks DLL and MS Build Community Tasks.targets. So to import this into our build script, we need to do two things. We need to specify a property called MS Build Community Tasks Path, which has to be an absolute path. Then we need to import the MS Build Community Tasks.targets. So let's set that variable first. I'm going to come up here to the top of my file in my unconditional property group, and I'm going to say MS Build Community Tasks Path. Now this is going to be the path to that folder I just dumped these two files in, which is going to have to be an absolute path. To make it an absolute path, I'm going to set this to the value of MS Build this. So MS Build this file directory, which is a new property introduced recently, which is why it hasn't been included in autocomplete, / tasks, which remember is going to be the absolute folder to that path. Okay, so now that I have that variable set up, let's go ahead and import the targets file. Underneath this, our conditional property groups, I'm going to say import project, and I'm going to pass in MS Build Community Tasks Path / and then I'm going to pass in the file name to this .targets file. So I'm just going to grab that entire file name, copy it onto my clipboard, and then paste it right there. And now I've imported MS-Build community tasks, which means now I can use all of those community tasks that were in that package, everything from zipping to FTPing to using Git and all that great stuff. So now let's scroll down to our deploy launcher because we still need to zip it up and then we need to upload it. Now the upload is going to be handled by some code that we'll write here inside of our build tasks, but our zipping can be handled by a task that we just imported. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, let's see here. I'm going to go ahead and say zip. Now, this isn't going to be a complete definition of zip yet. We'll see why that is in a second. But first I'm going to say zip file name equals, and then I'm going to pass in where I want it to go. Where I want it to go is /build/launcher/launcher.zip. That's where I want this zip to end up on. But then I also need to pass in the working directory and the files. I'm not going to worry about the working directory immediately. We'll work on that later in case we have any problems. But we need to pass in a files. Now, what is a files? Files isn't going to be, in this case, a string. It's actually going to be a collection of file references. In order to make a collection of file references in MS Build, you have to do a couple of things. You have to essentially create a variable with the create item task. And that will allow us to create an item and then name it something. So let's go ahead and do that. Files is going to be @, and then we're going to say something like launcher zip files. But we haven't created that item yet, so let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to say create item. On create item, I'm going to say include equals buzz MMO launcher. And then I'm going to basically include every single file individually. So I'm going to say buzzmmo launch or buzzmmo.launcher / and then debug a release. So we'll say build config / buzzmmo launcher.exe. But we need more than that. If we look at our build, we have our base and our launcher.exe and our launcher config. We don't care about our PDBs. We'll just package these 3 files up into a zip file. So I'm going to say buzzmmo launcher.exe, and then to separate it with the next file, I'm going to go ahead and say semicolon buzzmmo.launcher / build config / buzzmmo.launcher.exe.config semicolon buzzmmo.launcher / build config / buzzmmo.base.dll. So those are the 3 files that I want to zip up. However, we're not done. We've specified the 3 files we want to zip up, but now we have to set this variable to a name. So to do this, on the create item, I'm going to say output, and then I'm going to say task parameter equals include, and then I'm going to say item name equals launcher zip files, which I'm going to spell that correctly there. So it's launcher zip files is going to be what we get when we create the object. Okay, so in theory that should zip things. We might get some errors because of files folders that might not be created, so let's go ahead and see what happens when we go ahead and execute this. So I'm going to say /t deploy launcher and hit enter. Okay, we get a couple warnings. File not found, buzzmmo launcher debug. Okay, what's going on here is it can't find these files because the well, can it not find the files from the zipping? I wonder. It's not going to tell me. Let's go ahead and absolutely reference these files. To absolutely reference these files, we simply have to prefix everything with ms build. So, whoops, that is not what I wanted. ms build, and then we want to pass in ms build this file directory, and then a /. So this will reference this file absolutely, as opposed to relatively. Now let's go ahead and give the same treatment to this, and then give the same treatment to, oh, that's a lot of stuff. I think yeah, we want to do that for our config, and then we want to do it for our BuzzMMO base. So again, that's a really long, convoluted file, but really all it's doing is it's absolutely referencing 3 files and putting them into an item. Let's come back here and see if those warnings go away. File not found. BuzzMMO source, BuzzMMO launcher. Oh, I misspelled launcher. Of course I did. Make sure launcher, 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 launcher. Exe. Okay, so when we get these errors or these warnings, let's go ahead and try to debug them. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to copy this path directly into Explorer, hit enter, I get the proper area. Then let's go ahead and copy this part of the path and add it to the path we already have. And we get nothing. The reason we get nothing is maybe I misspelled it again. That's spelled correctly. That's spelled correctly. Okay, so it really doesn't want to find these files. I wonder if we set the working directory to something different, if it'll have a different idea or a different opinion about whether or not it can actually locate these files. So let's go ahead and set the working directory on our zip command. Working directory equals, and then I'm going to say ms build this file directory, slash buzzmmo.launcher slash build config. See if that fares any better. And we're still getting some warnings. And of course, it's because I did something dumb. Not surprisingly. We can go ahead and get rid of this working directory definition. That doesn't matter. Doesn't mean anything. I didn't think it would. The problem is that this is not the proper path. I'm sure there's a lot of people out there laughing at me right now because I have been staring at this path for the last like 5 minutes, and it didn't occur to me that it's not buzzmmo launcher slash build config. It's buzzmmo launcher slash bin slash build config. So let's go ahead and fix that on all 3 of these guys. Okay, so now we've done that, let's go ahead and do that, and we get build succeeded with no warnings and no errors. Let's come back to our project and see what happened. If we jump back into BuzzMMO, we see we now have a build folder. That build folder has a launcher folder. That launcher folder has a launcher zip. Launcher zip. Ooh. I just remembered what the working directory was for. Okay, so remember how I said the working directory doesn't matter? It actually does. The working directory is going to execute things or place things in the zip relative to that folder. I totally forgot that that's how it worked. So working directory is going to be buzzmmo launcher /bin/build config. So now that we've done that, let's come back up here, rerun the build, come back here, open up launcher.zip, and we get a whole lot closer, but not quite where we want to be. It looks like it's doing it relative to the current, so it's doing ms build this file directory, and then we want buzzmmo.launcher /bin/build config. This should be what we want. Oh, wow. It doesn't do it relative to the working directory, it does, or the current directory, does it relative to the working or the target directory. And the target directory is build launcher zip. So the working directory, let's just set it exactly to what directory we're passing stuff into. So we'll say /build launcher. That'll be our working directory. Let's rerun the build. Open up launcher, and it needs to be an absolute path. Of course it needs to be an absolute path. So I'm going to say ms build this file directory /build launcher. If this doesn't work, then I think I might cry. Actually, that doesn't even make any sense. I'm confusing myself. Of course that's not going to work. We don't want to do a working directory to that. We did want to do a working directory to buzzmmo launcher /bin/build config. It should be exactly what we wanted. But instead we get this, which is not what we want. I think I'm just going to cheat. Instead of specifying the working directory equals, I'm just going to say flatten equals true. And then let's hope that we have better luck when we zip up the client. Going back into our developer command prompt, type in launcher, we get a success. Come back to our launcher.zip, open that up, and we have our base launcher and config file inside of our zip. Okay, so yeah, I mean that's about all we'll need for zipping up our launcher. Let's go ahead and work on uploading the launcher. But yeah, let's go ahead and do that. So uploading the launcher needs to take a reference to this zip file and then upload it to our site. So to upload it to the site, we're going to need to specify the domain of the, or basically the endpoint. Where am I going to send this to? Am I going to send this to my local machine, or am I going to send this to production? And then we need to create a task that will create an upload to a web API endpoint specifying the correct deploy token. So just like we did before with our other task, I'm going to show a usage of this task and then we'll implement it. So in order to use it, we'll of course have to do a using tasks. Task name equals buzzmmo.build.tasks.upload file. Assembly file is buzzmmo.build.tasks/bin build config buzzmmo build.tasks.dll. Then we need a couple of properties, and we're going to set these properties on both our dev and our prod. So one of these properties is going to be the domain. Actually, I think we can get away with just setting the domain. So for the domain here, I'm going to say mmo2.3dbuzz.dev, which is my development. And then for release, I'm going to set the domain to mmo.3dbuzz.com. So of course you can pass these in, instead of setting them right here inside these property groups, you could of course pass these in straight from your build environment if you wanted to have these be a little bit more configurable. So then let's see a usage of it. So scrolling down, what we're going to do is I'm going to say upload file, which is the task name. And for the upload file, I'm going to say type equals launcher. Then I'm going to say env equals env. Then I'm going to say domain equals domain. And then I'm going to say deploy token equals deploy token. Now our deploy tokens is one thing that I don't want to hard code inside of this build script. That's something that will have to be passed in from either the command line or from our CI tool. But basically, now that we've done that, we can write our upload file class and, well, have it upload a file. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to come up here to our build. I'm going to create a new class called upload file. It's going to inherit from task, which is brought in from Microsoft Build Utilities, and he is going to have an execute method. Then I'm going to need a public string type, public string env for our input parameters, public string domain, public string, what do I call this, deploy token. And then the last thing that I forgot about is that we also need to specify the file we want to upload. So I'll say file equals .. build launcher.zip. And we're also going to need to pass in the build number, because remember the build number needs to be passed in to our upload endpoints. So I'm going to say timestamp equals timestamp, and then I'm going to say, what do I call that other variable? Version number. So I'm going to say version number equals version number. So we have our type, which is equal to launcher, environment equal to environment, domain equals domain, deploy token equals deploy token, file equals the launcher. Then we pass in our timestamp and our version number so that we can pass along the build number of that stuff. So now it should become apparent why we established our timestamp before doing all this stuff instead of just establishing our timestamp when we did the build inside the same code that updates the build info. And the reason for that is because when we upload it, we need to pass in that same timestamp. But if we regenerated the timestamp during the upload file, that timestamp would be different than the timestamp that the build info was built with. Okay, so now let's come back here to our upload file and add back in our file timestamp and version number. Alrighty, now we have all the information we need in order to do a deploy. So really, all the stuff that we've done so far really just leads up to this one moment where we actually perform a actual real file upload that'll hit a real website and do a whole bunch of fun stuff. Okay, so the code that we're going to have to write is we're going to have to instantiate a HTTP client, construct a multi-part form data content, and then shoot it over to a endpoint. So let's decide on the endpoint and the file name first. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say string endpoint, or how about API endpoint, comma, file name. And I'm going to say if, let's say, if type equals launcher, then API endpoint equals launchers, and file name equals launcher.zip. The file name is the file name that I want the user, when he downloads the launcher, to be given. Then I'm going to say else if type equals client, then API endpoint equals clients, file name equals client.zip. And then, so that we don't get any errors, I'll say else throw new argument exception on type, or let's just keep it at throw new argument exception. Okay, so now the fun part. First thing we need to do is import a new reference. So I'm going to come up here to references, right click, add reference. I'm going to come up here to assemblies. On framework, I'm going to pull in system web HTTP, or where is it? System web HTTP right here. And this will give me the interfaces that I can use to work with the web API on the website. So I'm going to hit OK. And now I'm going to construct a request. So the first thing I need to do is I need to create a form data. So I'm going to say var, or how about, let's call this multi-part data equals new multi-part form data content. Did I grab the wrong assembly? I did. It's net HTTP, not web HTTP. Yeah, take off web HTTP. Web HTTP is the hosting side of this. I just want the client side. The client side is net HTTP. So it's system.net.http. And let's make sure that we grab version 4.0 and not 2.0. Hit OK. And now we can bring that in by importing a namespace system.net.http. So this object will contain all the data that we're going to send along with the request. So let's go ahead and add the obvious things first. I'm going to say multi-part data dot add. Then I'm going to pass a new string content timestamp. I'm going to say comma timestamp. So that's timestamp parameter. Then we'll do multi-part data add new string content, and we'll pass in version number as version. But now we have something a little bit more complicated. We're going to have to actually send the file up. To send the file up, I need to say var, how about file content equals new stream content. And then stream content, the constructor, I'm going to pass in system.io.file.open, passing in the file name that we want to open and a file mode of open. So the file mode of open will return a read-only stream, and it'll also throw an exception if that file doesn't exist. Okay, so now we have our file content created, but we're not yet done with it. We actually have to go into our file content and modify its content disposition header in order to give it a file name so that it will be recognized by our API endpoint as being a file. So to do that, I'm going to say file content dot headers dot content disposition equals new content disposition header value, passing in attachment as the disposition type, and then I'm going to use object initialization syntax to set the file name to file name, and then the name to upload, because upload is the name of the field that we're passing, the name of this content that we're passing in, and it'll be picked up by our API endpoint. Okay, now that we've created our file content, then we say multipart data dot add, and then I'm simply going to say multipart data add file content. All right, we have one more thing left to do to create our request. I'm going to have to say multipart data dot headers dot add deploy dash token to deploy token. Okay, so that's pretty much creating our request. Now all we have left is to submit it. To submit it, we have to instantiate an HTTP client, so we'll say var client equals new HTTP client. And then all we do is say var response equals client post async, because this is going to be a post request. We're going to pass in string format https://domain/API/v1/endpoint/upload, passing in domain and endpoint, or API endpoint, into that. Then we're going to want to say, after that, we're going to want to say comma, as the HTTP content we're sending multipart data. And then I want to say dot result. And by accessing the dot result property of this client.postAsync, we're going to be making this turn this into a synchronous method, because we're not doing any awaiting. So the next line of code won't execute until the method has properly executed the response. Once I have the response in, I want to say if not response.isSuccess status code, then log.log error uploading file 01, passing in response.status code and response.content.toString. Finally, we will return response.isSuccess status code. Okay, so that is all the code required to hit our API. So let's go ahead and test it. First of all, jump over to the site and go into the admin panel and make sure you have a deploy token. Now, the deploy token that we're going to be using is the one that's scoped to our IPv4 IP address and not our IPv6 IP address. One of these days I'll fix it up so it doesn't matter if you use the IPv4 or IPv6, but for now, we're going to be using 192.168.127.001 for the deploy token because whereas Postman hit our endpoint using IPv6, the HTTP web client will hit our endpoint using IPv4. Okay, so we're going to want to copy that deploy token. If you don't have that deploy token, go ahead and create it. Then what I'm going to do is I am going to go into MySQL Workbench and I'm going to delete all of the launchers, all of the uploads that we've uploaded so far in testing. So I'm going to come here, I'm going to select all of these and hit delete. I'm going to try to. There we go. So that we'll start off with a blank slate. And now, the moment of truth, we will open up our command prompt and we will type msbuild buzz MMO build.proj /target equals deploy launcher space /p : deploy token equals, and then I'm going to paste in that deploy token. Then I'm going to hit enter. And when I hit enter, it says build succeeded. Let's see if it made its upload to our site. So let's come over here into our MySQL Workbench, refresh. We do see that the proper version number and version timestamp were set up. We do see that the original file name was indeed launcher.zip. Closing out of that, we can come back to our MMO2 3dbuzz.dev. We see download launcher version 1. Click download launcher. Launcher.zip is not commonly downloaded and could be dangerous. Let's hit keep on that. Let's click on launcher.zip and we have a launcher. So I know it's not so exciting seeing that, okay, so we can just type in one command and then suddenly we have an entire project or entire solution built. We have build numbers set up appropriately. We have it submitted to a website so that people can download it and only people who are authenticated can download it. Actually, that isn't pretty boring. That's pretty cool. And you should think so too. But I think this will go ahead and wrap up this video because when we get to talking about building our client, we're going to have a little bit more of a challenge because we'll have to deal with Unity. But overall, when we deploy our client, it'll just be the same scheme that we've used with deploying our launcher. So see you guys in the next video.